Hey everybody, welcome back to the Live Ultralight podcast powered by Outdoor Vitals. Today we are going to be doing a trip recap on a trip that we just got back from last week. This was a trip that we tried a year ago and had some issues with, I guess you could say. It didn't quite go our way due to some weather conditions, the deepness of the snow and some things like that. So we wanted to go back and attempt it again this year. It's just a phenomenal mountain range that we have in our backyard. And so going and summiting this peak is something that we've wanted to do for a while. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to talk through that story. We're going to talk through, lessons learned, gear choices, and hopefully just have a good time. So I'm going to crack open a soda here and we'll dive in. But how you doing today, Brigham?
Doing well. It was spring yesterday on February 1st, but it's
so nice.
Back to winter. I was actually glad it didn't snow as much as I thought it would, like last night and this morning. Basically none, but
yeah, I think that weather companies make all their money on over predicting bad weather so that you keep checking the weather and they get more ad clicks or things. That's my prediction because it was like it's going to snow last night and then it changed to snow this morning and then
the resort got 14 inches, which is pretty good. Like that's good mountain snowfall, but I was expecting to just be kind of rain and snow all day today.
Do you remember when we attempted this last year?
That was 2
February?
years ago.
That was 2 years ago?
2 years ago. Yeah.
Where did last year go? What? For real? We didn't try that last year.
No, it wasn't last year. It was 2 years ago.
Wow. That messes with my head a little bit. Time is absolutely flying. But wasn't it February?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah, it was. It was like
typically here we've got
pretty similar time frame.
We've got a pretty good base of snow by February. This year we attempted it a couple weeks earlier, just the end of January. But it hasn't been as snowy. But we've got a lot of snow on the forecast right now and through the next little foreseeable future. So we'll see if it starts to accumulate again. But yeah, other than that, anything new, I guess? Obviously, you're always working on developments, things like that. But any other new exciting things around the office before we get into this story?
You mentioned some development stuff, which is appropriate for kind of the podcast today. There were several items we were doing some good field testing on that we've had for a while, but it was this was a good trip to kind of have them in their element.
Yeah, it felt like about head to toe. We were testing things in the tents, out of the tents, just the whole time. So
yeah,
it was a solid trip in that sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we have a lot of developments coming in. If you didn't listen to the State of the Union podcast, I will preface that we don't have quite as many brand new products as last year. Last year was one of the biggest launch years we've ever had, but a lot of that was fueled by delays in COVID and then kind of everything stacking up. But we do have a lot of products under development, and there will be some product launches, and so stay tuned with that. And as per the usual, if you follow us on YouTube, you may get some little peeks at things. But a lot of fun stuff coming up. A lot of stuff I'm really excited about. But so let's step backward just a little bit to what this trip is and how kind of our experience on the first attempt. You can go find a video of this from, I guess, 2 years back now. Where I can't remember if the title of the video might be something like, negative 15 degrees, or coldest weather or something like that. But it was a super cold trip the last time. Yeah. The idea is, though, that we go in, we start from a highway that's paved that goes up to a ski resort. So we start right off the highway, we snowshoe in, and essentially, we're able to follow a bit of a road for over half of it, and then we tee off and go straight up to a almost 12,200 foot summit. This is the third highest mountain range in Utah, so kind of third highest mountain range peak here. So it's a very tall peak. It's very, very exposed, and we had this idea of, hey, let's go try to snowshoe up there and see how it goes. Now, the first attempt that we did, we really just should have moved the trip dates. We we're pretty set on the trip dates that we did. We headed out, and we had received like 2 feet of snow in some of these areas over the last 24 hours or so. And so basically it was probably one of the best definitions of just like a mental, slugfest, where you're just, the farther we would go up, the more deep the snow would get. So the more tired you would get throughout this hike, the deeper and harder it would be to move. And there hadn't been any like snowmobiles on the road, anything like that. We were just totally breaking fresh powder. And so at the start, it might have only felt like we were, going through a foot of brand new powder on top of a very big, kind of base of snow. And then the farther we got, it got up to the point where we were really pushing about 2 feet of snow. Like our snowshoes were sinking 18 inches or more into the snow, maybe 20 inches. It was intense. We were basically switching who was breaking the trail every like 150 yards because it was so exhausting to be the lead person. And to go the 4 miles into camp, it took us like 4 to 5 hours. So that tells you just how quick.
It was a little over 5 hours. Backing up real quick. So when you say we start right off the highway and we go up a road, we're not actually walking on what you would think of as a road. It just means the route. We're under the road is buried under feet of snow, so it's not we're not having this convenience of walking on a road. So I think that's an important distinction. This is a winter trip where we're wearing snowshoes from the truck, and the route follows what in the summertime is a dirt road, but in the wintertime, it just becomes a route that's, under 6 feet of snow. So there's no packed snow. It's not a groomed trail. There's sometimes snowmobiles that take that route, but on this date, there had been none. So, like as you described, with snowshoes, one of the, I guess, misconceptions for the uninitiated or the inexperienced is that snowshoes, you just walk on top of the snow. That's the case if it's packed snow. But, when you talk about there was probably a base of like 4 or 5 feet, and then we had gotten quite accurately about 2 feet of snow, leading up to the morning that we started. It was actively snowing when we started. So now, we're starting on from the trailhead or where we started. You're sinking about a foot, but every 200 feet that we went up in elevation, by the time we're halfway to our destination, we're at least sinking to our knees every step. This is with snowshoes. I have very high flotation snowshoes, and it was still the case, and it was. Plus, it's uphill the whole way, so it's almost like the snowshoes never like cleared the plane of the snow surface. So
really, they're just holding a pile of snow on top of the snowshoe.
Yeah, and so it's like you have resistance, when you lift your knee and when you drive your foot forward. And so I was telling Derek on the way up this last week, to kind of describe what it was like, because as we'll get into it later, the hiking conditions were much better. But I was like, hey, just for some perspective, there was a point, and it's in the video, the last video. Do you remember like when there was one point where you're like, hey, just so you know, in the last, I don't know, you said something like in the last like 5 minutes, we've gone like 100 yards or something like that, where it's like, to give you an idea of that pace, like it was less than 1 mile an hour. I mean, like
and
you
that's
said,
like
it was
all out going. Like
that's like maximum, maximum speed, and it was where we were probably like the last 30% of that trip. We were probably switching out like every 200 yards who was in front, just because it's probably at least twice the work to be the front guy when you're basically breaking trail through the powder. It was a physical trip for sure.
Well, and I want to preface that in this podcast we are going to talk about a ton of gear, from snowshoes to just a lot of things that we're using and why we do these trips, right? That's going to be kind of something that we talk about. But to come back to it, you said this multiple times. And you said it again on this trip. You said it on the last trip. Every time we go out on snowshoes, I feel like a quote that I'm going to hear from Brigham is, snowshoes are not an efficient way to travel in the backcountry. Yep. It's like this, there is a misconception that because you have snowshoes, like you're trucking along, you're moving, and the reality is there's nothing efficient about a snowshoe. It just makes something that would be impossible possible. So I don't know, because every snowshoe trip is so different. I don't know what I could even say as far as like an average speed with the snowshoe, because it's so dependent on the trip you're on. Yes, it does make it possible. Like going through that trip last year, I mean, we wouldn't have made it a couple hundred yards. We just would have been post-holing all the way down to our thighs or deeper, and we wouldn't have made it, more than 400 yards from the vehicle before we just would have turned around. So they did make it possible for us to get the 4 miles up to where we camped, but they're not efficient. And I guess first piece of gear to talk about would be snowshoes themselves. I was testing, and I would say testing. I'm kind of just always testing. I bought and I used a new pair of carbon fiber snowshoes from Comperdale. We've been huge fans of Comperdale poles. Absolutely love their trekking poles. In fact, they're in the Live Ultralight membership for purchase. And so I wanted to try out some of their snowshoes, and they had innovated this brand new carbon fiber, ridiculously light snowshoe. So I've been running them for, I guess, 2 years now. And that was interesting because Brigham is using the MSR Evo, the model of that.
Yeah, Evo Ascents.
And
they're old though.
Yeah, they're older, but they're like kind of that composite or plastic deck, have an extender on them versus the one I have. Mine are 25 inches, but they've got some holes in them, and they're just really focused on being super lightweight. And this trip really highlighted my lack of love for them, I guess you could say. In fact, we'll get to it at the end, what my full consensus was. But with snowshoes, it's interesting because it's not just about the weight of a snowshoe. When you're talking about, like, let's say trail runners, right? Like the weight of a trail runner or the weight of a hiking boot is so important because you're just logging so many miles. And yes, the tread pattern matters a bit. Like you want to, but so many of the name brand shoes have a good tread pattern already. Like they're going to have good grip. They're going to have some of these things. And so really like weight and just comfort, and the amount of cushion is what you're looking for there. And so I took that kind of philosophy of like, all right, weight on your feet just stacks up so much. Went with these carbon fiber ones, but really their flotation just isn't quite high enough. Especially for me, I sit about 200 pounds most of the time, and like there's kind of some hexagonal holes in them that allow a little bit of snow up and through there, a little bit less flotation, but it makes for probably a lighter weight piece. And then I don't have the ability to like add length to it, which like Brigham's, he can add a little bit more length to his and kind of custom tailor that for the snow conditions that we're in. And so, and then the last thing, which you'll definitely see if you watch the video to come out, those things, because of I think because of the way that they're built with kind of the ridge around the outside and also the hexagonal cutouts in them, they get snow on the deck, and then it chucks the snow at the back of my legs, my butt. It'll flip it all the way up and down my gloves, and the back of my trekking poles often just have this like snow caked onto the back depending on the conditions. And so for this particular trip, those weren't the snowshoe. Now, do I hate these snowshoes? No. I think that for if they're designed for light snow, less than 6 inches or even groomed trails, I would for sure take them. They're stupid light and efficient. But for a rugged mountain ascent in powder, not what I was looking for in a snowshoe. But I don't know. Like if I was to look, I think the ones that you have, Brigham, are probably the best. What do you think makes those snowshoes great, or what do you think are things that people could look for in a snowshoe?
Yeah, I would say first I'll talk about like what to look for in a snowshoe, and then my recommendation based on a lot of experience with them. So, the size and basically the length and or width of the snowshoe is the biggest contributing performance factor for, we'll call it flotation, but remember, you're not floating on top, but just the maximum resistance to sinking. So we'll call that flotation. So the longer the snowshoe, the better, or the wider. But when you're covering a lot of miles, length is better than width because now you're having to spread your feet out farther, which is going to create a lot of stress on the joints and make you less efficient over the miles. I would say look for a good length of snowshoe. And then the decking, there's some that have like an aluminum tubular frame with like kind of a vinyl or a PVC decking. And that's basically, if my hand is the snowshoe, it's what's filling in all the space. And that creates resistance on the snow with your body weight, right? So that is what adds the flotation. So what I would look for is something that has as much surface area inside the footprint of the snowshoe to resist sinking through the snow. So as solid as possible, as few voids or openings as possible, and then an appropriate length. You can, there are some snowshoes out there that get really long, and if you're a smaller stature person, you're going to have diminishing returns to a point. But, something at least, 25, 26 inches long, assuming it has a very solid decking, meaning not a lot of holes or spaces. And then you mentioned like the weight thing, right? Mm-hmm. So someone that's familiar with like trail running or just footwear and in general is going to kind of have that expectation that the best thing to do is to go for the lightest example. But that can not necessarily be the number one priority. So if you've got a super light snowshoe like yours, but it's short and has lots of voids, then you're going to lose all the efficiency that you've gained by going lightweight by sinking farther in the snow. So that's what I would say look for in terms of flotation. Now, also in terms of grip, grip is a big one because
well, we found out it was on this trip.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought much about it till this trip.
Yeah, you want as much grip as possible. That's what I would look for, as much grip. And when I talk about grip, generally a snowshoe on the bottom is going to have on the sides kind of a what I would call a runner with gnarly steel teeth. They kind of look like shark teeth. And those are steel, and those run the length of the sides of the snowshoe. You want those to be as long as possible because that's going to give you forward grip and lateral grip to help you not slide. So the longer that is, think of it kind of like the wheelbase on a car. You're going to be more stable. However, that's not the only grip you want. In a snowshoe, call it the binding where your foot sits, it has the ability to pivot within the snowshoe while the snowshoe stays on the same level plane. And under the forefoot, there should be a really big set of teeth, and they should be at least an inch long. These steel, they're triangular teeth. You definitely want those. And then a big one is some kind of traction elsewhere on the snowshoe that helps with the downhill. So it's on yours, they don't have any. On mine, they're molded into the decking, so they're like a composite plastic, but they're molded in all over the bottom in different angles and directions. And so that helps with, again, the side-to-side stability and then the downhill traction. So you want as much traction as possible, and it's almost kind of hard to not really know what is as much as possible until you take two of different brands and put them side by side. And then it's really easy to kind of say, oh, I see, that one has not as much traction and that one has a substantial amount more traction. So definitely look around and compare and look on the underside. And then the other thing I would say to look for is, I don't think all brands offer this, but I really like the ability to add length to my snowshoes. So some snowshoe brands have removable extensions, and they can add, in my case, I think they add 4 or 5 inches of total length to the snowshoe, and it's totally solid. There's no space on that extension. It's a solid deck of plastic. One other thing I would look for is what's called a heel elevator, and it's a mechanism, and yours have them, and I think they're a similar method. It's just a bar that when it's not engaged, it just sits flush with the snowshoe, and you never know it's there. But when you are going to be going uphill for extended periods of time, it's worth raising that bar, and it locks into a detent on the snowshoe, and so now your heel rests on that, and so when you're going uphill, it reduces the angle that your foot is actually setting down on, which makes it easier on your legs, on your calf muscle, and you're able to get better traction and better drive step for step. So that's what I would look for. It does help to pay attention to weight, but it is, in my experience, not the primary factor or the priority factor. I would prioritize everything else before I prioritize the weight of the actual snowshoe, because you'll find with snow, just having good traction and maximum flotation that trumps the weight of the snowshoe, because if you don't have those things, then you have no efficiency and no traction, no drive step for step.
Yeah, and I think as we go through this story, I'm just kind of pulling up and looking at snowshoes. Who knows? Maybe this will be something that we end up adding into the membership at some point, just because I think we're slowly learning which snowshoes would be ideal to recommend. But we will, as we get into this story, I think let's pause to highlight the differences in our snowshoes and performance on the trail, because there were some clear times where there were differences in performance.
Yeah.
But I think you highlighted all of them. The last one that I would add, though, that I experienced on this particular trail was bindings. So my bindings were like a cloth, like a nylon strap system. And look, when you're going out where it's never going to get above freezing temperatures, but when you're hiking and stuff like that, you may potentially melt some snow, and then that gets into that webbing. It becomes a nightmare to tighten those, to loosen those. It is pure chaos. So making sure that you're getting a binding that is using more of these rubberized straps, easy to use when you've got gloves on per se. Those things also come into play. So did want to highlight that. That was something that, coming back to it, those Compradel carbon fiber snowshoes I was using, I think they'd be great for mellow terrain, likely a little bit more packed snow. And if you're using them for a single day, they'd be awesome, right? Because your binding isn't accumulating moisture throughout the day and then becoming harder to use. You're going to be able to move really quickly, especially if it's somewhat packed snow. You can they have like a neoprene cover over the toes, which I actually really like, but it keeps a lot of the moisture off of your boots. But you could use really lightweight shoes with them. So you could, these things I feel like are really built for speed and a little bit more mellow terrain versus what we took them into. So, but we'll highlight some of the differences in field performance as we get up and kind of start talking about actually summiting the peak. But so last year, just to recap, we got up there. It was so brutal just to get the 4 miles in. We knew that there was really not a hope for us to get all the way to the peak because it was just getting continually harder and harder. Who knows? We might have got up to 3 feet of snow, and then the trail just gets steeper and steeper. And so we ended up not attempting to summit. We ended up camping that night, turning around, and coming back out. The idea, though, was that we would kind of set up our base camp and camp there 2 nights while we summited the peak. But with calling it early, we didn't end up doing that. So this year, we went in with the same itinerary. Hike about 4 miles in, set up camp, then do the 4 miles up to the peak, come back down to camp.
The next day.
The next day, yep. Yeah. And then spend night 2 there in camp and then hike out. And so, obviously, I think you could have blitzed this whole thing in a day in the right weather conditions, but we needed a couple of nights of testing of other products, and so it just worked out to be a good pace of a trip where we weren't potentially overextending, and we're getting 2 nights in, and just is a solid itinerary, I think. So this year we get up there. We had a couple of others tagging along with us, Derek and Joseph. Those are 2 guys in our marketing department. So they were the ones that were able to come on this trip. And so, yeah, I mean, we got out there, probably started hiking around noonish, midday, and went up the 4 miles. Now, something that and I'm pretty adamant on trying my very best to do is I really like getting into camp early when it's a snow trip. It just makes a huge difference to get your camp established before it starts to cool off around here, before the wind picks up, because it seems like always the wind picks up right as it's getting dark and dusk. So we do try that. Joe and me, we stopped to film some ads and some different things, and so we were a little bit behind the ball. I think, Brigham, you got into camp around 3:30, or was it 4:30?
It might have been 4:30.
Okay. And then we were almost a full hour behind you by the time we got in there. And to give you some perspective, I think it's a little over 1,000 feet of climbing and about 4 miles in. And we were sharing one big shelter, 3 of us. Brigham had his own hot tent, smaller, just 1 person size. But we have a bigger, like 8-person teepee that about 3 people in the snow with a stove is max. But Derek had already kind of patted out the snow, and so we got there. We had a leg up, but definitely was rolling into camp later than anticipated. Even though the conditions were significantly better, it still is just not fast-paced, fast-moving. Maybe I should pull up and just see, but I would guess to get that like 3.5, 4 miles, I bet it still is almost 2.5, 3 hours.
Well, so I was just going to comment on, so the conditions this time, one, it was a lot warmer, and then 2, there had been some snowmobiles that had gone up this route. So Derek and I actually did it was about 1 hour and 45 minutes. Like it was crazy how much faster the pace was, because I
was wrong. It was 1,500 feet of climbing. And my pace on Strava is saying 1 hour and 40.
Yeah, so it was pretty I mentioned like so many times, like hiking with Derek up there. I'm like, wow, this is night and day different from the last time. One, it was like just low 30s, I think. You know what I mean? It wasn't really cold. There was really light snow coming down, but not threatening. And then. It was
just enough to get in your eyes.
The snow conditions were great. Like it just made hiking on snowshoes is about as easy or about as efficient as it can be. Climbing 1,500 feet. Yeah, we did that. Yeah, it was about 1 hour and 45 minutes, and so that was nice. Definitely nice.
Not the 5 hours. I mean, so take into consideration, we camped in the exact same spot. One year took us 1 hour and 40 minutes. 1 year took us 5 hours.
Yep, it's bizarre. I mean, and this is so like that's
and we were working way harder the first time.
That's kind of like your range with snowshoes. Like that's the breadth of what your experience could be. Could be pretty almost as good as it gets, and then it could be as bad as it gets. And there's no like if it's a trip that requires snowshoes, like that's just kind of what you get.
Yeah, that is. I did not put that together. Just the level of starkness, but it was huge, absolutely huge. Anyways, so we got into camp. Camp set up fast, set up pretty efficiently, I think, even though we were rolling into camp later than I wanted to, especially with multiple hands to help get camp kind of set up. So some things, I guess, just to note for those of you that are interested in hot tents. What we're typically running, we've been running the Seek Outside systems. So I have a bigger Seek Outside. I think it's called the Cimarron. And then we're running their stoves. Their titanium stoves are crazy light. I know that there are some other stoves out there. Some have like windows in them. Some are full boxes. But my large U-turn stove is what it's called. It's like 2 pounds even. for a bigger size wood burning stove. It's really incredible what you can do. So you look at this, and for this snow shelter that sleeps 3 people comfortably, I mean, you could sit 5-6 people in there sitting, and then to sleep you're probably 3-4 would be pushing it. That shelter is about 3 pounds. I didn't bring any stakes. Just planned on cutting sticks and using those as the stakes. And then the stove itself, a little over 2 pounds. So you're about 5, maybe a little bit over that, but under 6 pounds for 3 people's shelters in the winter. Now, most of us did bring like a little ground cloth or something like that. So let's just call it 6 people, divide that up. It's about 2 pounds a person. Now, I carry most of that, and those guys carry nothing, but that's what it could be.
They certainly didn't carry anything out on their hike out.
yeah, the hike out, I was maxed out with space. I do bring like a small saw that's, I believe it's maybe 8 ounces or so, and then like I say, a little bit of a ground sheet, which can be pretty dang light too. So. But yeah, it's a pretty efficient system for Brigham's setup, because I have an identical setup to him. It's about the same, 2 pounds for your stove, and then that shelter's like 2 pounds or less. So you might be about 4 pounds all in with that system.
Yeah, it's like right at 4 pounds, which is, and it's nice because it's totally consolidated. Or I can consolidate that within my pack as one person. I like it. I have no need to divide that up among people, and it's easily, size-wise or what it takes up in my pack, it's very manageable. I was using a 45-liter pack, so.
Which is pretty wild, 45-liter pack with a hot tent setup, and, in snow conditions, you're bringing more insulation, you're bringing more clothing, so. And I never looked at your pack and thought it was overpacked, overstuffed, so.
Yeah.
You can get really light and do it really comfortably. Yeah. These hot tent setups, it feels a little bit like you're kind of, once they're set up and you're in there and the stove is rolling, it's such a huge reset, comfortable, relaxing environment. You're just feeding the fire and, melting snow and drying out gear and chatting. It can be windy outside. You're nice and protected in there. It makes for just incredibly enjoyable winter excursions.
I think it's a really interesting system, because I'd say it's a notch above like what snowshoes can bring to the table. Like, snowshoes are very utilitarian. There's nothing fun about it. It just enables you to do something that you otherwise couldn't. And then our hot tent setup, I'd say it's just a notch above that in terms of now it doesn't just enable you to do something that you otherwise couldn't. Once all the work is done, well, which it's never really done, but once the initial work is done, it is a bit of a luxury, but it's a luxury that provides a ton of utility. So, for example, you mentioned we like to get in the winter on winter trips. We really like to get to where we're setting up camp well before dark. There's some really practical reasons for that in a winter trip. There's no way you or I don't think most people can avoid sweating. Well, a sweat-soaked top against your skin is potentially dangerous in sub-freezing temperatures, right? That's where you're going to have the potential for hypothermia and a bad situation. So managing that becomes really important. And so getting to camp well before dark when you have that huge temperature drop, it's really practical, because now your activity level decreases, but you're still semi-active, meaning you're tamping down the snow to make your tent site. You're setting up the tent. You're pulling things out of the pack, and then you're going to find, in the case of a hot tent, so now you're going to find firewood, and then you're kind of hiking around a little bit, but at a much lower exertion level. So it allows your body to maintain enough heat generation that it's drying out those sweat-soaked clothes while you're getting work done that has to be done no matter what. So that's why it's nice to have that time. But the utility that comes from these luxurious hot tents comes in that if you don't get that clothing system dried out by your activity, you have the ability to do that now. And we know that there are ways to dry your clothes out throughout the night without a fire or without the hot tent, but it's a slower, more time-intensive and active participation-intensive method of doing it. Whereas when you have the hot tent, I'd say I was able to get kind of most of my clothes like 70% dry before I got the stove going. But then once you have the stove going, you're in there and it's between 60 and 80 degrees in the tent. Things are drying out and you're still, there's like still always little tasks to do. Like you're feeding the fire, you're breaking sticks, you step outside to saw a few more thicker chunks of wood. But you're able to do it with a bit of a more relaxed setting where it's not so urgent that you get dry. But you now know you've got like 2 or 3 hours to kind of slowly dry out and you're never cold. And that conserves body energy, which is really important, especially when you want to get a good night's sleep because you're at over 10,000 feet of elevation. You don't want to have elevation sickness. And the next day, you've got to climb a mountain. So the hot tent it's a great system. It does, it's kind of like snowshoes in that it's still work. But work. Now there's a little bit of comfort and luxury added to it, but there's tons of usefulness that you can constantly, take advantage of with that setup.
Yeah, and we'll do trips. We definitely do trips where we don't bring the hot tents. We've done them a lot. We'll probably do less of them, honestly. But if you were a very mission driven focus and you wanted to just go light, you were trying to be super efficient, you could go back to it. But 2 things I did want to bring up that I don't think you touched on. One, you want to enjoy these trips. You want to be fun. You want to be enjoyable. And it's not always that fun to not have the hot tent and just basically as soon as that sun is down, what are you going to do? You basically just climb into your sleeping bag to stay warm. So then you're laying in your sleeping bag from, say, 6 p.m. at night till 7 a.m. in the morning when it starts to get light, maybe longer. And so that is just a long time to be sitting in your sleeping bag. So with the hot tent, we don't get into our bags till, 10 o'clock sometimes.
Till it's time to go to
you climb in to go to sleep.
Yeah.
So that buys you, 5 hours or more of being able to sprawl out, move around, not just be in the sleeping bag. Because when you're going in those winter conditions and the temperature's dropping down to teens on the high side, likely lower, you're not just hanging out in your clothes, in your tent. It's cold. So you're getting in your bag, you're watching a movie or something on your phone, or you're listening to a book, or you're whatever. But you can't. I can't sleep for that many hours. So you're trying to fill some time. You're trying to fill some space. It's totally doable. But just know that when it's that cold, when it's those conditions, you're pretty much getting in your bag. And so the other thing I would say, though, is we definitely can dry out clothing. We have methods of drying out clothing without a tent to an extent. But that's also different on multi-day excursions. So how much moisture and things I needed to dry out on day 1 was totally different compared to how much stuff I felt like I needed to dry out on day 2 with longer time on feet, with more exertion, more exposure to elements, all of those things. My gloves were more wet, right? And just stuff like that. My pants are more wet. I've got more layers that maybe got more sweat in them, and so it kind of adds up the longer the trip you do. So now I'm not saying any of that to scare you away from doing trips without a hot tent. It's totally not required. We've done tons of them. We're just saying there's some real pros to the hot tent if you're interested, and they don't come at massive weight penalties. You don't have to add a tremendous amount of gear and weight and bulk in order to make these happen. So I think there's a lot of tents out there and tent makers out there. They make the tents out of heavier fabrics. Then the stoves themselves are 4 to 5 pounds. But just know there are cheaper options. And again, the options we've used so far, is through Seek Outside. There's some other people maybe coming to play in this space too. So there should be some more options here in the near future as well for the ultralight side of this category.
There is one really important thing that I forgot to mention is with that time, it's winter time, so water filters are out. It's freezing temperatures constantly, so water filters are not a reliable option. So as we're sitting in these tents for 3-4 hours, being warm, eating our food, drying our clothing out, we're melting snow because that's our water source. So that's where it's another luxury that's incredibly useful. So it's like if you're kind of taking score, it's like, yeah, there's luxury gets 1 point, but like this luxury now, there's all these critical must-do tasks that are happening because we have this luxury. So we could have 2 or 3 of us melting snow at one time on the top of the stove. Mm-hmm. So again, so there's always different methods for things. There are the gas stoves that you can take. So whether that's isobutane, which they start to lose their efficiency or effectiveness at a certain temperature threshold. And then there's the liquid gas stoves that you pressurize with a pump, like white gas or kerosene. Those are all viable options. However, we have one stove that we're able to hydrate 3 people at a time. Now, if you have a gas stove, that's one gas stove. So if 3 people want to do that, they all need their own gas system. So it is quite useful and very efficient because you're awake anyway. You're up, chatting, hanging out, drying out clothes. You're doing all those things anyway. And we were able to, melt. I don't know, 3 liters each night at least.
I overmelted
per
the second
person.
night, yeah.
And so it is really important. And it's for the weight penalty and the effort to have that system, I think it's totally worth it, all things considered. And so like that, both nights, that's what, like one of the critical tasks that we were doing is melting snow for drinking water. And I'll get into, kind of my experience with that on the second night once we get kind of down the road with the story.
If we ever really get into the story.
Too much winter trips. There's a lot going on. So much going on.
There's a lot going on.
They're fun to talk about.
Now, one other thing, just in terms of weight and bulk. Personally, I don't take a stove when I go in the winter, like a gas stove, if I'm taking a wood burning stove. Brigham, you did. So you can definitely do it both ways. There's some safety reasons to maybe do it like Brigham. So you have that as an option if you needed to start a fire or just needed quick heat or something like that. I bring a fire starter for sure, but I did not bring a stove. So you got some options and some different ways of doing that. But so we get in there on night 1, and there's so many more things I want to talk about gear-wise. There's watches, there's boots, there's food, there's a handful of things here. But I guess for this night, the last thing I'll talk about is we were testing out some new meals from ReadyWise, some like snack-sized meals, and absolute clear winner, the Apple Crisp. Everyone was loving this Apple Crisp. And then there was some like fruit and yogurt freeze-dried stuff that was really good. And so be watching the membership. Maybe a few months down the road here, we'll be adding some more snacks and desserts and things like that to the OV pantry section of that. But I will say this, sitting in that tent, hanging out and just snacking, I didn't like count out my calories for this meal. I just kind of filled up some bags and had a rough idea. Plus then I ended up throwing in some extra stuff that we were testing. Even with all the exertion that we did over those 2 days, I'm sure I ate as much calories as not, because you're just hanging out in there. You're having hot chocolate, you're having snacks and desserts and meals and stuff like that. So just a good time hanging out, talking to everyone. We had 4 of us in the tent, just hanging out before Brigham went back over to his tent and went to bed. But it's a good night. Went to bed that night, slept well. A lot of us were sleeping on the new Xtherm, the Neo Air Xtherm. We did also put that in the membership area, so if you need to save some money on a premium pad for winter conditions, it's in there now. But that pad is money. 7R value, crazy light for what it is. Just a phenomenal pad. We've used it for years. This is a newer model with the NXT, and I did notice, the extra 1/2 inch that it gave me. I found it to be a little bit more comfortable than the 2.5 inches that it used to be. And yeah, noise wise, I didn't think about it much, which probably means that it is an improvement, because I definitely thought about it on my old one. I mean, you'd move and it just sounded like a potato chip bag. And this time I'm sure it was still there, but it was fainter. So I'll give it some bonus points there too. So 2 thumbs up on the newer X-Therm, the NXT version. Really like that. And yeah, if you need to save some money on it, go inside the membership. So we get up the next morning. We have a very slow, lazy start, I would say. We didn't get up and head out of camp right away. The other guys, Derek and Joseph, they were not going to go up the summit. They were just going to do one night, head back into the office. So they got up, headed out, and then we headed out shortly after them. And I think I broke camp around 10 o'clock in the morning. That's maybe one downside of the hot tents is you strike up that fire, you hang out, and you can spend some time just hanging out in there and be comfortable. So
yeah, it gets really comfortable.
So yeah, I didn't roll out. We also knew that we weren't, I don't know, I didn't feel super pressed. I think we were trying to leave by about 9, but didn't feel super pressed on time and stuff. So yeah, I take off down the trail at about 10 o'clock, and Brigham was hot on my heels, except when I turned around, I was not seeing Brigham behind me. So I went about a 1/2 mile, and then I was like, all right, I'm going to take off a Ventus that I was wearing and just put on a Nebo windbreaker, which again, I mean, it's cold conditions. It's breezy up there. You're high up on the mountain, over 10,000 feet. But when you're doing that level of exertion, I was hiking in fact, I may have to go back and look, but do you remember if I had a mid layer on, or was it just the Nebo? I think it was just the Nebo.
Yeah, you were in just the Nebo.
So I was just hiking in a new updated Turn and a Nebo pretty much the whole day. So anyways, by the time I stopped and had slowed down a few times and filmed some things, Brigham finally came marching up the trail, and it was pretty apparent that he was missing something. So what happened there?
Things. There are a couple things I didn't have in my hands. Yeah, I think Tayson stepped off, and I think I was just getting my pack on, and I was just gonna relieve myself from the snow for a minute, and I was like, yeah, I'll be right behind you. And so when I did that and then started walking, I took 2 steps, and something did not feel right, and I realized I didn't have my trekking poles because they were holding up my tent. And so I've got the whole stove set up there, my sleep system's all set up in there, bunch of gear in there, and so Tayson he legitimately got a 1/2 mile, because I sat there and kind of had a conversation of frustration with myself. I was just kind of looking at my tent and thinking through, wondering if I wanted to take it down just to have the poles. Eventually, I decided that I would just hike without the poles. So
brutal.
And this, which is brutal. Like I mentioned, the trail up was really nice, but from where we went to the top of the mountain was mostly unbroken trail. There was a few snowmobile tracks for a little while, but it had also snowed about 4 or 5 inches that night, and so yeah, that wasn't great.
Yeah, so we kind of talked that over, and we're like, well, whoever's in the lead, we'll try to give the poles to, and
yeah,
and so we went forward under that mentality. So yeah, really the snowmobile trail died out pretty quickly. There were snowmobiles crossing the trail, but from about a 1/2 mile out of camp, it was pretty much just our own tracks. And then after about a mile, there was 0 snowmobile tracks. And then at about 2 miles, then it turns into a trail where we're just shooting up towards the top.
Yeah,
so
you kind of break off this buried dirt road, and then you break off to kind of just go up this this long ridge that takes you to the top of the mountain.
Yeah, and this peak, well, I guess I should say the trail to this peak on both sides of it, it's just nasty. It's just straight up. There's not like there's switchbacks. It's not like there's anything that helps you go thousands of feet up more efficiently. The ultra marathon that I've done, it goes up and over this peak, and it is the absolute worst part of the day. And even though it's early in the day, because coming up from the backside, it's just straight up on what you could argue is a game trail. There's no switchbacks. There's no anything like that. It's just straight up. And then on this side, it's much the same. So I remember specifically both times coming off of this peak. I mean, you're trying to run, but it's so steep that you're just killing your legs. Like, you're just blowing out your quads and things. And so if that gives you a perspective of what it's like in the summertime, in the wintertime, it's really steep, and it was very thick. So as soon as we stepped off of the road, the road that's 6 feet down underneath us, it got even more deep, more powdery. We started, and then you're also starting to climb. So, we're basically trying to make our own switchbacks in this and just move up. And I think, we tried a little bit of switching off the poles. Brigham actually had brought a shovel, and so I tried using a shovel when I gave him the poles, but basically I decided that I just wanted to keep the poles in my hands, and I would just break the trail, because it was slippery as well. So to give you an idea, in some parts of this, as we're ascending this, it's just really deep snow. And then in other parts of it, we could get up on kind of some more wind-swept faces where the snow is harder, or it wasn't quite as deep because the wind blows so hard up there. It's so exposed. And both brought their own challenges. The deeper snow, obviously, just physical exertion. But these other areas, they were slick. There's a lot of rocks you're stepping on, which can also be very slippery. And I don't know. At first, I just thought that my equilibrium was off, because I felt like I had a few drinks or something trying to climb up here between the elevation, the wind, just whatever it is, the exertion. I felt like I just was all over the place, and so I wanted the poles in my hand just for balance. But the farther we went up this thing, just grinding out, this part really slowed us down, because for a lot of the trail we've been averaging 2 miles an hour on the way up even. But here we dropped well below a mile an hour climbing this. But this is where it started to become pretty apparent that our snowshoes were just drastically different. So I was slipping often. In fact, there was one little lip where we had to go down. Kind of we descended just a little bit and then had to come back up. And I just slid straight down this thing. Whereas Brigham was able to cut across without trekking poles, cut across this and descend without sliding. Pretty much any steep downhill, I could just start to slide away. And then on the climb up too, I just didn't have the same amount of traction as Brigham. And that, I think, to give myself a little credit, I think that was probably the biggest factor. Well, anytime I'm at 11,000, 12,000 feet in climbing, like, I can get a little lightheaded. I do think that I was not feeling very planted on these snowshoes. It was slick. I mean, on the way down, I hit the ground, slid down on my butt a few times because my snowshoes started to go. I almost attempted, a sled run there, but thought it probably wouldn't be the wisest thing. But yeah, I mean, the difference though with my snowshoes and his, mine does have like that outer cleat or track, and it does have the grip on the toes. But on the decking itself, there's no additional grip. And then if you were to compare where mine does have grip compared to his has grip, his is just way more aggressive tread and more of it. So, his just really outshone the snowshoes I was using in terms of grip on a face like this, where you're climbing, you're hitting ice, you're hitting rocks, you're hitting deep snow, and it's all steep.
Yeah, those snow conditions it was just, I'd say the surface, condition was just it was variable. It was like very inconsistent. It's like every 50 yards it changed, from just powder to windswept crusty, hard packed snow to this kind of weird crusty snow that was on top of a really, a 3-inch layer of like just powdered dust that was really slippery.
Those little bushes, remember how they'd...
Yeah. And then we had these little bushes that if you got close to them, you'd sink. And then you'd have these really rocky sections where it was very windswept. So, there's probably only just a few inches of snow on top of or around these rocks. So sometimes you'd step and there'd be a rock right under your foot that you couldn't see. Sometimes you could see them. And so it was just very inconsistent. And so momentum and efficiency was a definite challenge. And so I'd never looked at the bottoms of your snowshoes, but like that's where you could clearly see the difference in the designs and the traction availability on those surfaces.
Yeah, I mean, I said the whole way up, and just that this was the durability test for that carbon fiber, because when it's 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 below freezing, it's windy, it's cold, and so you got cold carbon fiber, and then you're stepping on rocks with 200 pounds. It was a great durability test, and we'll get into that. But just a kind of a brutal climb. And all the while, if you turned around and looked below us, you could see pretty far, but looking above us, you just couldn't see much at all because of cloud coverage, kind of that foggy, just clouds rolling through. And it was kind of actively snowing, just like off and on, this real powdery fine, like not like it was putting inches on the ground, but like enough to like blow into your eyes and just reduce visibility. And
the visibility was one for sure, because the higher we went, the more the wind blew.
Yeah.
So whether the snow was falling or it was just blowing off the ground, the depth perception. So now we've got this very inconsistent snow surface, and so it was very unstable. Like we probably looked like a couple drunken dudes like stumbling up this mountain, which is that's what it looked like.
And there was a heck of a false summit in there because we couldn't see the top. And so you're looking around at this mountain over here, and you're like, well, where are we getting in correlation to that? And you could see this one above us, and you want it to be the summit. But there was some pretty solid false summits in there. And then by the time we got over that false summit and started to climb a little bit more, meanwhile, my electronics are all malfunctioning. My phone keeps shutting off because it's so cold, which is really frustrating because it's a newer phone that I just haven't had that level of issue with the phone before in cold temperatures. But it was shutting off, so I'm trying to film a little bit, and it's shutting off. And then my watch, I've liked this Coros watch a lot, but I don't know what was happening exactly. But it wigged out and gave us some extra elevation on that climb, it seemed like. And I think my heart rate stopped monitoring, and it kind of made me wonder if maybe Coros, while they focus so heavily on trail runners, if maybe they don't test them in the most extreme of conditions in cold temperatures or things like that maybe my last watch was, it was like the tactical version. So it probably did get a lot more testing in those conditions. But heart rate, I started to not trust on it. And then also my ascent, somehow it added, because I think on paper it was maybe 2,500 feet of climbing maximum. And we got like 3,700.
Yeah.
So something was kind of glitching there. But it was cold. The electronics are malfunctioning a bit with the cold. And we're just kind of grinding away. And then visibility became so tight in there that we just really couldn't see the top at all.
No.
Until literally I look up and I'm like, holy frick, we're at the top.
Yeah, that's the sign. Yeah.
There's the sign. Like, wasn't expecting that. I'd given up hope on it being like around the next corner type of thing, and then we were there. And so we got up to the top. I've got a little video clip of me kind of showing visibility where I'm standing about 6 feet away from a cliffy edge, and you can't even see the cliffy edge. So we got a heck of a view up there after all of our efforts. I did sign the book that was in the frozen mailbox with, basically just a big ice chunk in it. And we didn't spend a whole lot of time there, even though we'd ground to get up there. I think in a perfect world on like a summer condition, right, you get to the peak and you stop and you you have your food, your snacks, and all that. But in these conditions, it was more like the wind is blowing our tracks off. It's actively snowing, and there's enough cliffy edges up here that we probably should just try to follow our tracks down as soon as we can.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting how quickly the wind, covered up tracks that we had just set like 10 minutes prior to, because we were just getting to the top and following our same tracks down. But yeah, tracks 100 yards away we were already
searching.
starting to get difficult to follow. And why that was important is I mentioned we took this ridge. It's this really long, drawn-out ridge, is because that's the safest, that's the only non-avalanche terrain route. So it's a ridge, so either side of the ridge is, over a 30% slope, so like consider that out of bounds, no man's land. And so that's why, once we started going down and we had no visibility, it became really important to follow our tracks so that we knew we were taking the safe route, because with the visibility, you just couldn't see the topography. Like you could not see. And so like you could easily wander off, 5 degrees to the south or to the north, and in 150 yards, you could find yourself on a 40-degree slope, which is like, really dangerous, especially in windy conditions and what that does to the snow. So, it was, I think we started making really good time, and it didn't take a ton of energy, but what took the most time was just like the focus of finding our track or staying on our tracks.
Yeah. I mean, what took energy, locating the trail was not easy. And there was a few times when we'd lose it for 10 feet or so and kind of re-find it as we're searching. But I would say for me, this is when, again, snowshoes started to come into play, because going on the downhill, my snowshoes became worse, way more slippery. This is where I think the tread on your decks made a huge difference, because I could just slide. I mean, Brigham did not have poles, and he was like sliding way less than I was with poles, dug into the snow and whatnot. And then, there was something else I was thinking with that. Shoot. I've lost it. But yeah, I mean, so those are just way, way slippery. And then, man, that was going to bug me. It'll come back to me. But, my calves were super, like, I was actually pointing my toes on the way down to try to dig in that front cleat, which is not ideal, because on the way up, those heel lifters that you have on snowshoes, mine kept falling down, and eventually I just gave up on picking them up. And that was a huge difference in fatigue level. When those were staying up for me, and you're able to keep your foot at a higher angle without having to like stand on your toes, that made a big difference in fatigue. And so now not only did I have more strain on my calves coming up because my heel lifters weren't staying locked out, on the way down again, I'm now pointing my toes. And by the end of this whole trip, then like the next day, that night, the only thing that ended up being sore on me was my calves. And I attribute that strictly to the snowshoe issues and malfunctions. So did just want to point that out. But yeah, I mean, we came down, we scooted down pretty quick. Again, now it's like even more foggy. It's snowing a little bit more. And so we end up just saying, hey, we passed this yurt, which we didn't know existed, down 2 miles, let's say, from the peak or so.
Right off the road, the trail.
And so, why don't we just push, get all the way down there and stop and have our lunch? So we decided to do that instead of, kind of plopping down in the snow and eating. Because if we can get in that yurt, it's just, you're out of the wind at least, and you have a chair. So get down there, and it was a little bit farther than both of us remembered. So by the time we got there, we had been like, time on feet was like, I don't remember, 5-6 hours or something. It was like 4 p.m. when we stopped to have our lunch finally. Yeah. So we'd had some snacks. I had tried to put down as many snacks as I could, especially on the way up, because I try to be really conscious of calorie intake and fluids. But on the way down, I kind of was like, oh, we're going to have food. We're going to have food. Going to have food. And by the time we got to that yurt, I was famished. I was ready for food, absolutely, after that climb. And so we went in the yurt. Had our food, kind of hung out there for maybe 30 minutes, eating and just able to take our gloves off, and it wasn't piercing cold and whatnot. And then we, headed out, made the last 1.5 miles, 2 miles down to camp. And we knew that we wanted to get there a little bit early because we did expect some chores, coming back to that. And so got to camp, 8 miles essentially up and down to get back to camp. And we were, time on feet was like 7-8 hours. So it gives you kind of an idea of just maybe speed there with a 30-minute. I mean, we didn't sit down until lunch. Like we'd stop, but it's not like we were sitting down and resting at all, because you're on snowshoes and you're in the snow. So, I got back to camp. I just started cutting up a bunch of firewood. Brigham literally had to shovel snow off of the tent because it had put so much snow onto that teepee style tent that we'd lost feet of room on every single side of the tent.
Yeah. I mean So I think it snowed again like 4 or 5 inches the night before. So the snow slides down the steep edges, but then eventually it hits the ground, and so the rest of the snow that slides down after that just starts piling up, and it did. Because I was like shoveling the snow off the bottom wall of the tent, and it had pushed in at least 1.5 feet. So it just kind of like shrinks the footprint of the tent, and so.
I was surprised because Brigham's like, okay, I'll do that while I go for wood, and I was chasing around wood. We're in the summertime. This is actually a pretty popular spot to camp, and so firewood is actually kind of hard to find. So I was finding firewood. It was taking time, and I kind of kept coming back and looking at Brigham, being like, man, he's only halfway around this tent. But I started, as I started watching and realizing there was just a ton of snow and a ton of stuff to move off of that tent. And then we had to retension the tent. I mean, that tent grew, I feel like 50% in size by the time we were done, just because the amount of snow that had accumulated from the night before and then throughout the day of snowing. But spent about an hour doing those camp chores. Then we headed in right at dark, and it's about perfect timing. Got the stove lit up, and we had a full bag of fresh snow, essentially, that we were melting off. And, we're both trying to melt 2-3 liters of water. And I just spent the rest of the night in there eating, drying stuff out. And melting snow. I don't know if there's much else to talk about there.
It was, again, that system, that stove tent system became, for me, like, I was very glad we had that, because I started the day with, like, to be straightforward, like, I did not start the day with enough water. Like, I took 2 liters of water for that whole endeavor that we did. Not enough, and so I by the time we got back to the tents, like I could feel significant effects of like being underhydrated, and so like when it's that cold, you're at that elevation, like it became priority number 1 for me to just start melting snow and consume it. Like, so I'd say the first liter of snow that I melted, I just drank, and I needed it bad. Like I could definitely feel it, but then. Again, once we kind of got, things under control, we got the chores done, I got my hydration kind of under control, then we just had, hours to just sit there and melt more snow, and I melted another, 3 liters. I think, we each at least that much. And, had some hot cocoa, ate our dinners, and,
Dried out, especially our base layers and kind of our mid layers that we were using.
Yeah.
Very damp, very wet from the amount of exertion. So we spent time kind of drying those out. So 2 pieces of gear I think that would be valuable to talk about. Let's talk about this one, I guess, tonight. Gloves. So gloves in the wintertime are a big deal. I have spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars on gloves. I bet I've spent $1,000 on gloves when I really think about it. And those are just the ones for me, let alone for anyone else. And one piece of a glove system that we've just found to be tremendous is using a shell versus a waterproof and insulated, glove, like a do-it-all glove. Mm-hmm. By thinking of your hands, just like you would think about, an ultralight layering system, you can make some really big quality steps. So for instance, our Tushar rain jacket is not a soft shell with a fleece liner. It's not, a down jacket with a membrane. It's not, it's not a combination jacket. It's just the rain jacket. So you can put it on, you can put it off. You can put it on over next to nothing. You can put it on over the top of multiple layers. If you start to sweat inside of it, you can take it off to let it dry, and it dries quickly because it's not accumulating moisture. And so if you take that same concept and apply it to your hands, I think that's a huge upgrade to look for people. So both me and Brigham have these mitts that are a waterproof mitten, but there's nothing else on the inside. It's just like a rain jacket per se. Now they are, a heavier set piece than a rain jacket, because with your hands, you're typically taking a lot more abrasion. You're, the higher likelihood of durability needing to be higher.
Yeah, the base fabric is a little bit heavier, and then they've got some reinforcing, gripping material that's, some kind of like rubber TPU, and so they're reinforced, but they're like 2.5, 3 ounces for the pair.
Yeah, and those just there's such a value add to a winter trip, and there's 2 reasons. One, during the daytime, I wore those all the way up to the peak. Well, almost all the way up to the peak. It started to get pretty dang cold with just those shells. Now and because really when you're exerting that much energy, what you're really trying to do is just not let the thief of the backcountry, the cold wind, steal your heat away. So by having those on, just a shell, it just keeps the heat that you're putting off in your hands a little bit better. And so my hands are sweating most likely, or at least putting off some moisture as I'm going. And so it doesn't matter though, because I can flip those inside out and dry them out later. And so, yeah, just I hike in those a lot in the winter. Plus, if I need to take my hands out, I can easily slide them off because they're a mitten, and then I've got dexterity in my hands, slide them right back in. They're oversized, so you can layer with them. Huge advantage. And then, like I say, I use those a lot of the day. I eventually switched to a different glove because it started to get really cold up on the peak. But when we got back down into the hot tent, I just take those mitts, I flipped them inside out. They were damp on the inside. Dry them out. Takes half a second because there's really no material for moisture to hold on to. And then they're good to go for the next day. So I wanted to highlight at least that piece of a glove system. Huge value add, work exceptionally well for the winter. I think it works well in the summer, but these are probably heavier duty than you might need in a summer condition, but could still work really well, 3-season conditions for sure. So just look into that. I think the ones we're using right now are an OR branded mitt, but something to highlight. We really like them.
It makes for like a very versatile system. It's like for me, because you don't always need a waterproof glove. Like hands down, like you just don't need necessarily waterproofness. And so you can make whatever combination with or without the shell mitt as needed. So, and they're made big enough such that you can put whatever glove you're wearing, whether that's a thin liner glove or a big insulated puffy glove, inside. And that shell, if anything else, is just blocking the wind, and that's what keeps your hand warm. And you turn them inside out, they dry so fast. So that glove is not something that you have to worry about moisture, whereas if you're using like a down puffy glove or some other kind of insulation or a fabric or a wool, like that's all going to get moist from your body sweat. And so those take a lot longer to dry. But the nice thing about that mitten, it almost opens the door to like, a dozen combinations that you can do with like 3 or 4 other lightweight gloves, and so it adds a ton of versatility and effectiveness to the system.
And to pair that in contrast with other gloves that I've tried over the years, I do have gloves that have basically that kind of a shell, but then they've got insulation inside of that, and it's all a one-piece system. Every time I've gone out with those gloves, my hands start off super warm, right? Super warm. But then throughout the combination of maybe your hands putting off a little bit of moisture, or you getting the glove down in the snow or getting some moisture on the outside of the glove, eventually they slowly start to wet out. And by day 2, those gloves get colder and colder and colder. And even in a hot tent scenario, drying them out can prove to be difficult. For example, this particular set of gloves that I'm talking about right now, one time I washed them at my house in a washing machine. I hung them upside down so that the moisture could drain out of the gauntlet end of the glove for over 24 hours in a 70-degree home. The next day, I checked on them, still totally wet. And I think I may have even given them another half day. And then I was like, these aren't ever going to dry. Like, they're going to get moldy before they dry. So I ended up having to painstakingly flip these gloves inside out, which is hard when, you've got fingers essentially with insulation and all this in order to get those to dry. So that was like a huge wake up call to me to be like, I'm never going to dry these in the field. It's going to be so hard to dry these in the field that it just became like this isn't a good option scenario. But that glove, I mean, that's a well over $100 glove. It's like pinnacle of what people might recommend out there. But just from our standpoint, treat your hands like you treat your body. Individual layers, you can layer up, you can layer down as you need, and you're not trapping moisture in. Because even if you have an insulative piece, whether that's a liner or an actual glove with insulation in it, but no membrane on it, those will dry quickly too, because you can separate them out and moisture can flow freely between them. So just treat it like you treat your body when it comes to layering on the gloves, and your hands will definitely thank you for it.
I think that's the best way to think of it is your hands are part of your body. You have multiple pieces that you take into the backcountry for your body. Treat your hands the same way, because just like you wear one, say, base layer, mid layer, shell, or insulating jacket, you wear those for certain conditions or activities. You do the same thing with your glove system, because just like you can't just have one top and bottom that does everything for you in January in the mountains. Like, doesn't exist, right? Same thing with your hands. So it's very effective and worth whatever the weight is to take multiple pieces of handwear so that you're using them conditionally. So if it's, now I'm breaking firewood, I'm going to switch gloves to this other glove, because it doesn't matter what happens to this glove because I'm only using it when I'm doing XYZ. And you've got 3 or 4 of those pieces, and that whole set is going to weigh like 10 ounces. That's where you really start to find like what you can do comfortably by having multiple options in your pack for your hands. You can't go back.
I mean, on that trip, I had 3 sets of gloves, and between all of them, under 10 ounces for sure.
Yeah.
Combined, right? One was really a working glove for handling that stove and handling firewood. Another was an insulative glove, and then one was the mitt, the shell mitt. So definitely think of it that way. You'll thank us later when you go try that out for yourself. Okay, so that next night, it got colder. Water was freezing inside the tents. So I think I tracked the temperature, and it was down into the mid-teens or so, like inside of the tents. So definitely a colder night than the first night. The first night, I mean, it was like, we jokingly said it's almost balmy.
It was, it was muggy in the tent. So, yeah, I mean, we had cloud humidity cover all night, and then the snow accumulation on the tent becomes sealed insulation, and it seals off all the ventilation. So now you've got no ventilation and insulation on the wall of the tent. It was quite warm. Like I think we both kind of talked about how I was over insulated the first night. Like uncomfortable. But the second night, the pressure system, the air totally cleared up, and it got a bit colder.
What's interesting, I'm just pulling this up on my phone, is kind of the stats from our thermometer. It even the second night. So the first night, 100% got to 96% humidity in the tent. 96%.
Yeah.
The second night though, got still up to 80% humidity inside the tent. I mean, we're in a desert here. Like humidity typically around here is way low.
Less than 30%.
So definitely getting humidity inside the tent, and way more that first night when it sealed off the edges. And then, inside the tent, 15 degrees. So not the coldest night. I mean, you can have that cold of a night in the shoulder season. But again, that is the temperature inside the tent. So it might have been a little bit colder outside the tent.
To contrast,
and I did have, my stove does keep some coals all night long. It probably doesn't have much of an effect at all, but maybe 1-2 degrees.
Well, yeah, I think so. I think it could add 1 or 2 degrees. And then to contrast it from the last trip 2 years ago, that trip it got down to like minus 13. So and the highs,
30 degrees
that day,
swing.
like the high was colder than our highs on this trip. And so, massive difference in just the conditions, the outcome, everything.
Yeah. So next morning, get up. I actually wasn't going to start a fire. I ended up starting a fire because my water had frozen. And rolled out of camp essentially after putting it all away. And we made great time. I mean, we cruised at like it was a 3 mile an hour pace down because now we had multiple sets of snowshoes and it was downhill. So we cruised out of there. Overall, awesome trip. There's a few points where you're really pushing and fighting and stuff, but we had the time and whatnot that it didn't feel like we were, chasing time and a struggle in that sense. And so in a lot of ways, it was pretty chill. I mean, to have that much time just hanging out in the hot tent too was relaxing and just a really good trip. Didn't see anyone else up there. Just had the mountain to ourselves. Beautiful, beautiful country up there with snow on it. I mean, we didn't touch on this, but it's snowing all night and there not being a ton of wind. The trees were just perfectly flocked. Just a really, really pretty and enjoyable trip, and a good trip after attempting that trip and not making it up there. This one went off with pretty much no major issues. Yeah. The only major issue or I guess gear issue was on day 2, the metal ring had popped out of my snowshoe, the cleat or rail, on the side of it had popped out. And so I did have to bend that back in, and kind of, if I stepped wrong, it would bend back out. And I need to look and see if I need to send those back to Compradale. They do have a really good warranty program, but I'm not sure if it broke the carbon fiber or if it just popped out of the carbon fiber and I can bend it back and get it in there. But again, that was kind of the final straw for me and not being super sold on the carbon fiber trekking or snowshoes. I think they have their place. They're designed in Austria, and I think that they're probably killer for some of the trails and conditions I've seen over there for what people typically do in the winter months. I love it. Europeans, man, they get outside in the winter. Americans, we just hunker up. But Europeans, it seems like they will still go, snowshoeing and strap on skis and go cross country, skiing and stuff like that. Whereas I feel like if it's not downhill skiing, like people don't do it here. But that popped out. That was annoying, and was kind of the, between that and the binding, by day 2 having, I thought I dried them out pretty well in the tent and got the bindings all, dried out, and I couldn't move them in the next morning. So that was super annoying, but so not something I recommend at this point. But yeah, got down to the truck. Great hike out. Maybe last question on a piece of gear to cover, and then we could probably wrap this up. Boots. So actual boots. I picked up a pair of Salomon, I think they're called Tundras, last year or 2 years back. I've loved these boots. They have, I don't remember if it's 600 or 800 grams of a Primaloft insulation in them. They've got kind of a furry inner coating on it, or a liner in them. And they're quite light for how warm they are. Investing in some boots can go a very, very long ways and just adds a lot of comfort. Anytime I was in the boots, my feet were not cold. Yeah, they can get cold when you're sitting, not moving. Maybe you don't have them by the fire or something like that. They'll start to cool off because, you're going to have a little bit of moisture in there from your feet sweating. But yeah, those have been exceptional. Brigham, I know you tried out a much lighter weight pair of boots and insulation than typical. So why don't you touch on those and what you thought of them?
Yeah. I picked up another pair of Salomons. They're a dedicated, Salomon markets them as a winter hiking boot. They're really lightweight. I would classify them as like a mid height. But they're like the shape or the profile of them is almost kind of like kind of a retro basketball shoe, which is interesting. I don't think that's what they're going for, but they're designed to be a winter hiking boot. They're really light, quite flexible. So comfort-wise, they were fine. I actually quite liked them on all of the hiking, strapping them into the snowshoes. That was all fine. I think this trip would be the limit of temperature range. Like I said, anytime I was doing any of the hiking, my feet never felt cold. I didn't have any hot spots or blisters. They were flexible, which really helps with maintaining blood circulation and keeping warm feet. However, the second morning when it got down to about 15 degrees, that was for sure beyond the limit, because that morning I wasn't really active. It was mostly kind of staying in one 10-foot perimeter, packing up gear, taking down the tent, shoving all the gear in my backpack. So over that 45-minute period, my toes got very, very cold. They basically, at least my big toes, went numb. And it took about 15, 20 minutes of hiking to get the circulation enough and to regain feeling in my toes. So I'd say they were not, I wouldn't recommend those for like this type of trip. Like, they were fine until that morning, and I was able to walk my feet warm again after about 15 minutes, but that's not something I would want somebody to be in the position of. The difficult part with these boots was that I couldn't find on Salomon's website or any other online retailer's website any information that specified how much insulation was in it until I got my hands on the shoe. So until the shoe came in the mail, it says 200 grams of insulation, and that's just not adequate for these conditions. I wouldn't recommend that. Again, walking and exerting myself uphill with the flexibility, that's what kept my feet warm. But being at 15 degrees and just very mildly active, those shoes were inadequate in terms of keeping feet warm. So it's kind of like a positive and a negative experience. I would definitely use them in conditions of 30 to 35 degrees, or if I knew I was just doing a day hike.
Yeah, you're moving.
These to me are a day hiking shoe. Like, yep, it's going to be cold, but you're going for a snowshoe hike, even if it is 15 degrees, because you're hiking and you're active, the feet are going to be warm. But for this type of trip where it's a multi-night trip, then I wouldn't recommend them for that.
Yeah. One thing I just wanted to specify here too is the amount of insulation in those boots is probably the most important aspect. What I've been impressed with over time is if you take a boot, and it doesn't have to be like a super tall boot, it doesn't have to go way up your leg, it doesn't have to be a super heavy boot. It needs to be warm enough for the area that it's covering. And then you can use, gaiters essentially around your ankle area to seal them off. Highly recommended, even if you had a tall boot. And so there is still ways to kind of lighten up your feet and maybe not have like a suit. Like you do not want, in my opinion, you don't want a big pack boot, right? Yes, they're super warm, and yes, you can dry them out easily by pulling the liner out and stuff like that. But just way overkill versus having a boot that might be, doesn't go as far up your leg or something like that, and then you're using a gaiter to seal them off so that no snow is getting in the top, because a lot of the moisture that gets into a boot can come from the top down. And so, yeah, a lot of people that do like again, coming back to like these Compradel ones, they have that little neoprene cover over them. And when I was talking with the owner of Compradel, he basically was saying like, oh yeah, like we use very minimal boots and shoes over here when we're snowshoeing, because you have that neoprene cover. You could rock something like a gaiter, and you just don't need a big heavy boot. So keep that in mind. I do think that you're going to want, for conditions like these or colder, you're going to want 600 plus grams of insulation. And it is frustrating when you're shopping around and you can't get that information online. I don't know, for us at Outdoor Vitals, it's really important that we give as much transparent information as possible so you guys can make good decisions. But sometimes we're consumers and we get just as frustrated.
Yeah, totally. I guess one other really big factor is with like membrane lined winter boots like Gore-Tex or some other brand, that blocks all the breathability. So in, I'd say, decades of winter hiking experience, any waterproof boot that I'm wearing, I'd say 90% of the moisture that accumulates inside my boot is from my feet permeating that moisture. It's from sweat. And the breathability of those Gore-Tex membranes is not anywhere near sufficient enough to evacuate all that vapor. So it all just accumulates. So even with a very insulated boot, and even though they feel warm because we're walking or hiking, eventually, especially on a multi-day trip, that moisture will start to rob your feet of the heat. So that moisture will become a problem, and your feet you'll wonder why you've got these warm insulated boots and your feet just aren't warm enough. It's because of the accumulation of moisture inside. Now, if it's cold enough, you spend one night, that moisture is going to turn to ice inside the boot. So inside the foam and the insulation and the liner, that's just all going to freeze. So the next morning you're putting on ice, frozen boots. And so being able to manage that is really important. Having a hot tent helps. But so with these boots that I took, I specifically used vapor barrier socks to at least mitigate that aspect of there was no moisture getting into my boot. So I used a really thin liner sock, put a vapor barrier sock over that, and then put my wool hiking sock over that. So the only thing inside my boot that got wet was that really thin liner sock. And those are really easy to dry out, so much more easy to dry out than the inside of a boot. So after all the sweating, the insides of my boot were 100% dry because I'm using a gaiter, a vapor barrier sock, and then my actual hiking sock was also dry because it was outside of the vapor barrier sock. So that probably gave me quite a boost with those inadequately insulated boots. It's kind of a thing that you have to be aware of, especially on multi-day trips.
Yeah, for me personally, I don't use the vapor barrier socks in a situation like this because I do have the hot tent, and you can dry your boots out pretty well, and so I just kind of rely on that. If I was backpacking and I did not have a hot tent, for sure, vapor barrier socks, or literally get a plastic bag or some kind of a plastic piece and use that as a vapor barrier sock. And you're going to save and keep your boots from freezing up, from holding in that moisture, and from getting progressively colder the longer the trip goes on. So definitely a good tip. And yeah, people definitely don't think about it, but I know for at least my feet, my boots get wet from my feet, not from the outside most of the time. I definitely have my feet annoy the crap out of me. I swear, if they're even warm for like half a second, I swear they start to sweat, and then my feet are cold the rest of the day, and it's just super annoying. And that can be like a day in the office. Like it's such a weird thing. But yeah, manage that. You can use vapor barrier socks, plastic bags. We've done that before, or really anything like that. So. Okay, so all in all, the trip ended up being about 16 miles, quite a lot of climbing, obviously a lot of snow, and a really good time. So I think we've covered tons of the gear, tons of really good tips here. I hope you guys enjoy this. We really need to figure out a good way for you guys to ask us questions and maybe start answering them more on the podcast. I think we could offer a lot of value doing that. And we may, we've talked a little bit about trying to bring the podcast a little bit more back internal. We've done a lot of interviews and those are great. We love doing those, but we have a lot to say internally and sometimes those are a little bit easier with some of the time frames that we have to just sit down and record versus kind of prep for interviews. And I think based off of listener data, you guys love these, right? So do what you can to, if you have questions, email them in to us. I think the Live Ultralight podcast at gmail.com is still the one that we can receive questions in on, and we'll try to answer those in future episodes, especially, a trip like this. You guys may come up with questions that we just didn't cover. So let us know. Make sure you like and subscribe the podcast. Really appreciate that. Helps us be seen. Share it if you would, if you found value in this, or you got a buddy that you're trying to get out to go, winter camping. Hopefully this will convince them. Winter camping is definitely one of our favorite times to be out. It's a totally different animal, totally different beast, but it's amazing in and of its own. Different conditions, I guess, or different. It's just different. It's just great in a totally different way. Yep. It pushes you, it really does. It pushes you to learn and not be able to, I guess, skimp over things. In summer conditions, you can often be like, oh, I'm not going to worry about layering up or layering down or moisture management, or I'm not going to worry about this or that. Winter conditions, it forces you to, and it makes you a better backpacker. And it makes you, be able to push yourself farther in any conditions. And it builds confidence, right? If you ever want to go do some really, really intensive, bucket list, go hike up, Denali or some crazy, 20,000 foot peak. This is the kind of stuff that's just going to educate you, teach you, and help you make those kinds of trips happen. And then in the summer months, you'll already have that A grade in knowing how to manage things for the most part. So definitely highly encourage it. Like you say, share it with your buddy who you want to take out with you on a snow trip, and we'll catch you guys in a future episode.